The English morning arrived the way English mornings always arrived in October, without enthusiasm. A low gray overcast sat on the Bedfordshire countryside like a wool blanket, and the fog that had gathered overnight on the grass of RAF Dunstable's airfield lay in thin, cold layers that caught the first pale light and held it without warmth. The perimeter lights of the station were still burning, amber and indistinct in the mist, and the smell of the air was that particular English combination of wet grass and aviation fuel and coal smoke from the station's boiler house that the men based here had long since stopped noticing. Flight Lieutenant Edward Corn had been at Dunstable for 11 months. He had been at war for 3 years and 41 days before that. Through the desperate summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe came over southern England in waves, and the squadrons of Fighter Command flew 3 and 4 sorties a day until men were sleeping in their cockpits between scrambles. And in all of that time, he had developed a reliable instinct for days that were going to go badly. This was one of those days. He could feel it in the particular quality of the fog, in the silence of the airfield, in the faint sound that had been growing from the west for the past several minutes, and that was now resolving itself into something recognizable and entirely wrong. 2 engines. American. The note was different from anything based at Dunstable. Heavier, with a raw, aggressive quality that the Merlin engines of the station's Spitfires did not have. A sound like something that had been over-engineered beyond the point where elegance was the objective. Corn stood in the front rank of the welcoming formation and looked westward into the fog with the expression of a man being introduced to a distant relative whose existence he had been notified of, but had hoped might prove to be a rumor. Beside him, Pilot Officer Pierre Duval of the Free French Air Forces had straightened almost imperceptibly, the way a man does when he hears something he has not heard before and is not yet certain whether to be impressed or alarmed. "Americans," Corn said, keeping his voice low enough that only Duval would hear it. "God help us." Duval considered this. "They gave us the Mustang," he said after a moment. "They gave us the Lightning. Perhaps these machines are worth something." "The Lightning," Corn said. "2 engines, twice as many ways to die." He said it with the flat finality of a man who has done the mathematics and arrived at a conclusion he considers closed. Duval did not argue. 2 years of war had taught him which of Corn's pronouncements were worth contesting and which were simply the sound of the man's grief moving through his mouth in the form of opinions. Corn's 74 combat sorties were written in the lines around his eyes, in the slight, permanent tension of his jaw, in the way he assessed every unfamiliar aircraft as a potential threat before he assessed it as anything else. The sound became silhouettes. 2 dark shapes emerged from the western fog, low and fast, lower than they should have been, lower than courtesy or airfield regulations strictly required, directly over the grass at an altitude that made the men in the welcoming formation instinctively drop their chins and shorten their necks. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines of the 2 aircraft produced, at that range and altitude, a sound that was less a noise than a physical event. A pressure wave that moved through the chest and left a brief silence in its wake before the sound arrived properly, the way lightning precedes thunder. The aircraft were dark blue, almost black in the morning light, and their inverted gull wings gave them a silhouette unlike anything in RAF service, bent downward at the center like something that had been pressed upon from above and had not quite returned to its original shape. They made a circuit of the airfield. One broke away and set up for landing approach. It came in fast and sat down hard on the grass. Not graceful, nothing like the particular firm delicacy of a good Spitfire landing, but precise in the way that heavy machinery is precise, hitting the intended point and staying there through an act of controlled weight rather than controlled lightness. The pilot who climbed out of the first aircraft moved in the way that certain men move in operational environments, economically, without waste, with the slightly deliberate quality of someone who has trained himself out of unnecessary gesture. He was not tall. He pulled his flying goggles up onto his forehead and surveyed the welcoming formation with dark eyes that performed a rapid, unconscious assessment. Left to right, rank to rank, before settling on Colonel Sir Reginald Barnes, who was walking forward from the head of the British line. The second pilot came off the wing of the other aircraft already smiling. He was younger than the first, younger than most of the men in the British formation, and the smile had the uncomplicated quality of a man who had not yet been in enough bad situations to develop a complicated relationship with unfamiliar ones. "England," said the second American, to no one in particular, and apparently to everyone in general, with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been looking forward to this specific piece of geography for some time. "Damn! Real England!" The first American did not look at him. "Stop that, Tom," he said, in a tone that suggested this was not the first time he had said it, and would not be the last. "We are not on a sightseeing tour." Colonel Barnes arrived before the first American and extended his hand with the calibrated correctness of a senior officer performing a diplomatic function he has been ordered to perform but has not been consulted about. The handshake lasted precisely long enough. Barnes was 51 years old, regular Army, RAF rather, since before the previous war had finished, and his face had the weathered, architectural quality of a man who had spent decades in institutional settings and had come to resemble the institution in return. He was not pleased. He had made this clear in his communications to Group Captain Whitmore at 11 Group Headquarters, and he was prepared to make it clear again in person if the situation required. "Captain Harlow," Barnes said, "welcome to RAF Dunstable. I am Colonel Barnes. I will say directly, my pilots are experienced men. They require instructors, not nursemaids." The American, Captain Jack Harlow, 29 years old, Pacific Fleet, 116 combat sorties over Guadalcanal and Bouin and Rabaul, looked at Barnes for a moment with the expression of a man measuring a distance. "Colonel," Harlow said, "with respect, your pilots fly Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Corsair is a different animal, different weight, different character, different habits. It will kill a man who doesn't understand it, and it has done exactly that on multiple occasions to pilots who were considerably more experienced than inexperienced." "British pilots," Barnes said, and the temperature in his voice dropped approximately 2 degrees, "have transitioned to new aircraft without the assistance of American advisors." "They have," Harlow said, "and the Corsair killed more of its own pilots in its first year than it killed Japanese. I am here to change that arithmetic. That is all I am here to do." Barnes looked at him for a long moment. Korn, standing 4 paces behind and to the right of Barnes, was watching the exchange with the attention of a man who has spent 3 years reading the dynamics of command under pressure, and finds the current specimen professionally interesting. Flight Officer Hana Novak, standing at the far end of the British line, was watching Harlow with the quiet, particular attention that was his characteristic mode of observing anything he considered worth understanding. Novak watched things the way some men read, carefully, without advertisement, with the intention of retaining what he found. Barnes nodded, a small nod, as though he were conceding a minor point in a larger argument he had not yet decided to abandon. "Very well," Barnes said. "You will have your opportunity, Captain." It was not a welcome. It was, in the specific grammar of the RAF, something marginally short of an objection. Harlow accepted it for what it was and said nothing further. Because a man who has flown 116 combat sorties over the Pacific has developed, among other things, a precise understanding of which silences are worth filling. The fog was burning off. Through it, catching the first true light of the English morning, the 2 Corsairs sat on the grass of Dunstable Airfield and waited with the patient, inert menace of machines that had not yet been explained. That was what Harlow was here for. The 4 Corsairs had been rolled out of the main hangar before first light by Sergeant Billy Murphy and his ground crew, pushed by hand across the wet grass to the hard standing at the edge of the flight line, where they now stood in a loose row, their dark blue paint absorbing the thin October morning without reflection. Murphy had been working on aircraft since 1931, first on Hawker Harts in the Canal Zone, then on Hurricanes through the Battle of Britain and beyond. And in 11 years of handling other men's aeroplanes, he had developed the particular proprietary relationship with machinery that characterized good ground crew the world over. A relationship compounded equally of professional knowledge, personal investment, and the specific tenderness of a man who understands that the thing he maintains is the only thing standing between another man and the ground. He had looked at the Corsairs for a long time the previous evening when they were towed into his hangar, walking around each one slowly, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. When he had finished, he had said to Corporal Evans, "Big." And then he had gone to find his dinner. Now the British and French pilots stood before the 4 aircraft in the pale morning light, and Lieutenant Thomas Byrd, Harlow's second man, 24 years old, from Georgia, whose enthusiasm for everything European had survived intact through the previous day's reception, was conducting the morning's technical briefing with the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. He had a clipboard. He moved around the nearest Corsair with the proprietorial ease of a man showing off a house he is proud of, touching surfaces, pointing out features, explaining the inverted gull wing, bent sharply downward from the root before angling back up to the outer panel, and the reason for it, which was the enormous Hamilton Standard hydromatic 3-bladed propeller that measured 13 feet 4 inches from tip to tip, and required the shortened landing gear that the gull wing made structurally possible. He explained the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders in 2 radial rows, 2,000 horsepower, a displacement of 2,800 cubic inches, with the reverence of a man describing something he found genuinely sacred. Flight Officer Hana Novak listened with his arms folded and his eyes moving between Byrd and the aircraft in steady alternation, storing information with the methodical care of someone who understood that what he was learning now would matter later in conditions that would not allow for review. Pilot Officer Pierre Duval stood at an angle that allowed him to see both the aircraft and Byrd simultaneously, his expression concentrated, asking no questions but missing nothing. Flight Lieutenant Edward Korn stood slightly apart with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man determined to withhold judgment until judgment was unavoidable, which was the closest Korn could come to an open mind. Byrd completed his walk around the fuselage, noted the 6.50 caliber Browning ANM-2 machine guns, 3 in each outer wing panel, each with 400 rounds of ammunition, noted the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, noted the self-sealing fuel tank, noted the visibility problem caused by the long nose and the cockpit position set back 32 inches from its original location to accommodate the enlarged fuel tank ahead of it. He noted these things with the cheerful precision of a man who has presented this material before and knows which parts land well and which require management. Then he reached into the cockpit. There was a hydraulic lever on the left side of the cockpit interior. Byrd operated it. The sound that followed was unlike anything in the previous morning's arrivals. Not a roar, not a crack, but a deep, deliberate mechanical groan. The sound of heavy metal moving under hydraulic pressure through a sequence it had been designed to perform. The outer wing panels of the Corsair, each one 11.5 feet of metal and fabric and gun bays and fuel, began to rotate upward around the fold point that sat approximately at the junction of the center section and the outer panel. Slowly, with a weight and deliberateness that made the motion feel almost biological, they rose. The aircraft's wingspan of 41 feet contracted to a folded width of 17 feet as the wings came up and over, settling into the stowed position with a series of mechanical engagements, locking pin seating, hydraulic pressure equalizing, and a final sound that was something between a click and a clunk, the sound of a large and precisely engineered thing arriving at its intended position. The Corsair stood there on the hard standing, with its wings folded vertically above its fuselage, like a very large, very dark insect that had decided to make itself smaller. The transformation from predatory aircraft to compact, almost domestic object had taken approximately 8 seconds. The silence on the hard standing lasted longer than that. Korn's mouth had opened slightly. This was not an expression he produced often or willingly, and had anyone pointed it out to him, he would have denied it. But it was visible to anyone paying attention, and Novak was always paying attention. Duval had taken a half-step backward without appearing to be aware that he had done so. Novak himself was simply looking at the folded wings with the expression of a man filing something carefully away. "Folding wings," Bird said, with the satisfaction of a man who has produced a demonstrated effect. "For carrier operations. Saves deck space in the hangar below. We love them in the Pacific." Korn found his voice. It took a moment. "You want us," he said, and his voice had the careful, controlled quality of a man counting to 10 inside his head. "To fly that." "Well, we'll put the wings back first and—" "The wings," Korn said, and the control was beginning to slip. "Fold." "They fold, yes, but they don't—" "The wings of an aircraft," Korn said, "do not fold. The wings of an aircraft are fixed. That is the fundamental—" "They're perfectly safe when—" "They fold." Korn appeared to be working through a logical sequence he found deeply unsatisfactory. "You are telling me that the wings of this aircraft on which you propose to train pilots who will then take it into combat against the Luftwaffe, are designed to fold." "For carrier storage," Bird said. "On the ground. When you're flying, they're fully extended and locked. The locking mechanism is absolutely—" "I don't care what the locking mechanism is," Korn said, with a precision that had moved past anger into something colder. "A wing that is capable of folding is a wing that, under sufficient stress, will fold. That is not a wing. That is a hinge." Bird opened his mouth. Harlow, who had been standing 15 feet away with his arms at his sides, said, "Bird?" Bird closed his mouth. Harlow walked to the Corsair without hurry. He did not explain what he was doing. He reached into the cockpit, operated the hydraulic lever in reverse, and waited while the wings came back down. The same heavy mechanical groan, the same deliberate motion, the outer panels descending and locking into the extended position with the solid, definitive engagement of a properly engineered structure finding its load path. He stepped back. Then he climbed onto the wing root, reached into the cockpit again, and operated the lever twice more. Fold, unfold, without comment, letting the mechanism speak in its own language, which was the language of repeated demonstration. He dropped back to the hard standing and looked at Korn. "Flight Lieutenant," he said. "How many combat sorties?" Korn straightened. 74. "I have flown 116, the majority over Guadalcanal, Buin, and Rabaul, against Japanese Zero fighters that outturn this aircraft and outclimb it below 15,000 feet. He paused. "This aircraft has saved my life 23 times. I kept count." Another pause. 3 bolts per wing panel, Vought design. Rated to sustain 8 times the force of gravity in positive load. The wings do not fold in flight. They have not folded in flight. They will not fold in flight. Korn looked at the aircraft. He looked at it for a long time, with the expression of a man who has been presented with an argument he finds logically adequate and personally objectionable. Novak unfolded his arms. He walked forward to the Corsair, stood beneath the wing, and put his hand flat against the undersurface of the outer panel, feeling the metal. Cool, damp with morning dew, absolutely solid under his palm. 3 bolts, Novak said quietly. Each wing. "Each wing," Harlow confirmed. Novak nodded once, the way a man nods when he has verified a piece of information he intends to act on. Duval was looking at the aircraft with something that had shifted from shock toward assessment. The expression of a man from Lyon who had lost everything he loved and had therefore developed a very specific relationship with the question of whether a given tool was adequate to a given purpose. If the machine gives us what you say it gives us, Duval said, then we learn the machine. Korn said nothing. But he had not looked away from the Corsair since Harlow had folded and unfolded the wings, and in the quality of that sustained attention there was something that was not yet acceptance, but was no longer simple refusal. Murphy appeared at Harlow's elbow, wiping his hands on a rag with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had seen many things and found most of them manageable. "She holds together, Captain," Murphy said, without inflection. "Checked the fold mechanism myself last night. Engineering sound." He folded the rag, put it in his pocket, and walked back toward the hangar without waiting for a response. He had said what needed saying. The October sun was burning through the morning overcast now, thin, English, offering more light than warmth. The 4 Corsairs stood on the hard standing in a row, wings extended, waiting. The officers' mess at RAF Dunstable had been a farmhouse dining room before the war, and it retained certain qualities of that origin. A low ceiling with exposed beams, windows that looked out over flat Bedfordshire fields rather than anywhere purposeful, a fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the east, which it did most evenings. The furniture was RAF standard issue, functional and indifferent to aesthetics, and the portraits on the walls were of men who had commanded the station in previous iterations and who regarded the current occupants with the uniform blankness of all institutional portraiture. Harlow was eating alone at one end of the long table when Duval sat down across from him without invitation or apology. He placed 2 glasses of Scotch whiskey on the table between them, with the directness of a man who has decided that the social formalities applicable to this conversation are fewer than might normally apply, and looked at Harlow with the particular quality of attention that Harlow had noted in him on the flight line that morning. Not hostile, not deferential, but precise. The attention of a man from Lyon who had watched the Germans occupy his city and had concluded that imprecision was a luxury the current situation did not offer. "Captain," Duval said, "I want to know the truth about this machine. Not the official version, the true version." Harlow looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the glass. "The Corsair has 3 problems," Harlow said. "The first is landing visibility. The nose is long, longer than any fighter you have flown, and the cockpit is set back 32 inches further aft than it was on the original design, to make room for an enlarged fuel tank. When you are on approach with the tail down, the nose blocks everything ahead of you. You cannot see the runway. You cannot see the field. You are flying on instruments and on faith and on the altimeter. And if you get it wrong, you hit the ground with the nose pointed at the sky, and you do not walk away from it." Duval did not blink. "How many?" 4 men in 1 squadron in the first year. Not in combat, landing. On a clear day, on a marked runway, at their home field." A pause. Outside, the English rain had resumed. The persistent, unambitious rain of an English October that did not storm so much as simply continue. "The second problem," Harlow said, "is the torque on takeoff. 2,000 horsepower through a 13-foot propeller produces a rotational force that pulls the aircraft hard to the left at full throttle. You hold it with right rudder. If you do not hold it, if you are slow by half a second, the aircraft goes left off the runway. We had a lieutenant on Guadalcanal. 3 years of flying. He flew everything the Navy had. He was slow by half a second on takeoff one morning, and he went into the mechanics working on an aircraft at the edge of the strip." Harlow paused. 2 mechanics. Duval's hand had not moved from the glass. He was looking at Harlow with an expression that had no name in the standard inventory of expressions. Something between the complete attention of a man absorbing information he intends to act on and the stillness of a man managing something internal that he has decided not to show. "Third," Duval said. Harlow drank, set the glass down. "If you have to bail out," he said, "the tail section will take your head off if you exit incorrectly." The horizontal stabilizer sits at a height and angle that intersects with the trajectory of a man going over the side at speed. My wingman, his name was Danny Cole. He was 20 years old, from a place called Chillicothe, Ohio. His aircraft was hit over Buin. He bailed out. He did not know about the tail section. Nobody had told him. He looked at the glass. I was 200 yards behind him. I saw it. The fire shifted in the grate. Rain moved against the windows. Harlow and Duval sat with the silence of men who have been long enough in the company of specific and irreversible facts that silence is the appropriate response to them. You don't seem like a man who enjoys this work, Duval said finally. I don't. Then why are you here? Harlow looked at the fire. Because Danny Cole might have lived if someone had explained the tail section to him. No one did. Now I explain it to everyone I train. He paused. That's all it is. Duval turned the glass in his fingers. My family is in Lyon, he said. I have not had news of them in 14 months. I fly because it is the only thing I can do that might affect the outcome of what is happening to them. He looked at the Corsair through the mess window. It was visible on the hard standing in the wet darkness, lit by the perimeter lights, folded wings open now, standing in the rain with the patient solidity of heavy machinery. If this aircraft gives me a better chance than what I have been flying, I want to know it. All of it. The true version. Harlow nodded. Then I'll teach you the true version. They drank. Two men from different countries, carrying different kinds of loss, in agreement about the only thing that mattered. The first training flights began at 0800 the following morning. The overcast had lifted enough to give them ceiling, and Bird stood at the edge of the hardstanding with a radio transceiver and a clipboard, tracking each aircraft through its circuit with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that the notes he took might save the life of the man in the cockpit. Korn went first. He had said nothing at dinner the previous evening, and nothing at breakfast, and he had arrived at the aircraft with the expression of a man reporting for a duty he has decided to perform without complaint, which in Korn's lexicon was the closest available position to enthusiasm. The takeoff roll went well for the first 400 yards. The Pratt & Whitney caught at the first start, settled into its characteristic deep, irregular idle, smoothed as the throttle advanced through the gate to full military power. The Corsair accelerated down the grass strip with the weight and momentum of an aircraft that weighed 12,000 pounds fully loaded, and Korn held the right rudder exactly as he had been briefed, firmly, continuously, without the instinctive relaxation that caused pilots to lose the aircraft in the first few seconds of the roll. Then the left wing came up and the aircraft yawed, and Korn was a fraction of a second late on the correction. The Corsair went left. Not catastrophically, not into the mechanics or the perimeter hedge, but left, enough that the left main gear was off the grass and on the asphalt taxiway border for 3 full seconds before Korn caught it with right rudder and opposite aileron and dragged it back to the center line and got it flying. Bird exhaled. He wrote something on the clipboard. In the air, Korn flew 3 circuits in silence. He was precise and controlled, the way a man with 74 combat sorties is precise and controlled, not because the aircraft is easy, but because he refuses to allow it to be harder than his will to manage it. On the 4th circuit, he set up for landing, reducing power, lowering the gear, trimming for approach speed. The nose came up. The horizon disappeared behind the long cowling of the R2800. Harlow's voice came through the RT, the radio telephone, in Korn's headset, level and unhurried. Korn, you're high. Come down 200 feet. Watch the altimeter. Look at the runway from the left side of the nose, not over the top. Use your peripheral sight line. Trust the altimeter. Trust the machine. I cannot see the runway, Korn said, and his voice in the headset was tight with the effort of a man managing an emotion he does not intend to display. You will not see it the way you're used to seeing it. Look left of the nose. The runway edge will be there. Altimeter, airspeed, sightline left of the cowling. Don't fight the approach. Fly it. A pause. The Corsair descended. The airspeed held at 95 knots. The altimeter unwound. It was a hard landing. The main gear hit the grass with a thump that was felt rather than heard, and the aircraft bounced once, the notorious bounce of the Corsair's oleo struts, which compressed fully and rebounded with stored energy, before settling back down and rolling out in a reasonably straight line to the end of the strip. Corn climbed out. His face was the color of chalk. His hands, when he pulled off his flying gloves, were not entirely steady. He stood on the wing for a moment, looking at the aircraft with an expression that was not the professional assessment of an experienced pilot, but something more personal. The expression of a man who has been shown something about himself that he did not know before and is not yet certain what to do with the knowledge. He looked at Harlow. "Again," Corn said, through his teeth, without room for interpretation. The single word of a man who has decided that the obstacle in front of him is not larger than his willingness to go through it. Harlow looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, with the particular economy of a man who does not use gesture wastefully. And the nod meant something more than simple acknowledgement. It was recognition. The same recognition that passes between men who understand that what they are doing is difficult and have decided to do it anyway. Corn climbed back into the cockpit. Novak, standing at the far end of the hard standing, watched all of this without moving. His arms were folded. His face gave nothing away. But his eyes were on the Corsair with the sustained, purposeful attention of a man who is not watching a training exercise, but learning something he has decided he cannot afford not to know. The training had gone on for 2 weeks without interruption, and in those 2 weeks, RAF Dunstable had become a different station from the one that had watched 2 dark blue aircraft emerge from the morning fog with sullen British skepticism. The change was not dramatic and not announced. It accumulated the way competence always accumulates, through repetition, through small corrections, through the gradual replacement of unfamiliarity with knowledge and knowledge with instinct. Corn flew 8 more circuits before his landing stopped being hard negotiations with the aircraft and became something closer to conversations. Duval mastered the torque correction on takeoff by the 4th session, with the methodical application of a man who has decided that mastering it is not optional. Novak flew the Corsair from the 2nd day with a quiet, almost unnerving precision that made Bird say to Harlow one evening that the Czech flew like a man who already knew where everything was going to be before it got there. Harlow said nothing to that. He watched Novak from the ground the way he had been watching him since the first morning, with the sustained, neutral attention of an experienced pilot assessing another pilot, accumulating evidence, arriving at conclusions he had not yet shared with anyone. The afternoon the alert came was overcast and cold, the kind of English afternoon that carries winter in it like a premonition. The 4 Corsairs were on the hard standing, and the pilots were in the crew room, Corn reading a technical manual with the aggressive concentration of a man determined to understand something he initially resented. Duval writing a letter in French that he folded and put away whenever anyone approached. Novak sitting by the window, looking at the airfield with the particular stillness he carried everywhere. When the tannoy system on the station wall crackled to life with the flat, procedural voice of the duty controller. "Radar contact, course north-northwest, multiple tracks, estimated target, Southampton." The crew room was empty in 4 seconds. Harlow crossed the dispersal at a run and found Barnes already outside the operations block, standing with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man doing rapid calculations that he did not particularly like the results of. The duty officer was at his shoulder with the radar plot. 20-plus Junkers Ju-88 medium bombers in tight formation at 15,000 feet, with what appeared to be a close escort of Focke-Wulf 190s above and behind them. 6 Spitfire Mark Vs from the station's own squadron were already being scrambled from the southern dispersal, their Merlin engines catching one after another in the afternoon quiet. The sound of them climbing through the RPM range with that characteristic rising note. 6 Spitfires, 20-plus bombers, fighter escort of indeterminate number. Harlow looked at Barnes. "Colonel," he said. "Your Spitfires are going into a bad ratio. My pilots have 2 weeks on these aircraft. They know the machine. Let them fly." Barnes looked at the Corsairs. He looked at the pilots. Korn already in his flying gear, helmet in hand, standing at the wing root of his aircraft with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for someone in authority to arrive at the same decision. Duval was climbing into his cockpit. Novak was already strapped in. "The Corsairs have no operational clearance in this sector," Barnes said. "They are training aircraft." "They have 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns each and pilots who can fly them," Harlow said. "Sir, the mathematics are not favorable to hesitation." Barnes was quiet for a moment that was longer than it should have been and shorter than Harlow had feared. He looked at the sky to the south, where the Spitfires were already climbing, their contrails beginning to form at altitude. He looked at Korn, who was looking back at him with the direct, unflinching attention of 74 combat sorties requesting permission to become 75. "Flight Lieutenant," Barnes said, "are you fit to fly?" "Yes, sir," Korn said, without hesitation and without qualification. "Then get airborne," Barnes said. "All of you." They joined the Spitfires at 12,000 feet over the Hampshire coast, the 4 Corsairs climbing fast on full military power, the R-2800s putting out everything they had in the cold air. Below, the English Channel was gray and choppy, running southeast toward France. Ahead, the German formation was visible as a dark mass against the overcast. The Ju-88s in a tight bombing formation at the center, the Focke-Wulf 190s weaving above and behind them in the loose, aggressive pattern of experienced escort pilots who have done this before. Harlow had Byrd on his left wing, and Korn, Duval, and Novak in line abreast behind them. He spoke on the radio telephone in the measured, economical language of a man who has briefed combat formations before and knows that what is said in the next 30 seconds is what will be remembered when everything becomes fast and loud. "Listen carefully. Spitfires take the escort. We go for the bombers. Speed is our advantage. Do not turn with them. Do not let them slow you. Attack, break off, reform. 1 pass, assess. 2nd pass if you have separation. Byrd, you are with me. Korn, Duval, Novak, 2nd element, 30 seconds behind. Call your targets." 3 acknowledgments. Korn's voice was level. Duval's carried something underneath the single word. Compressed, controlled. Pointed like a weapon at something specific and 17 months distant. Novak simply said he understood, and the way he said it left no doubt that he did. The Ju-88s grew in the windscreen. They were big aircraft, twin-engined, angular, the Jumo 211 engines in their blunt nacelles producing a dark exhaust trail that smeared the sky behind the formation. Their defensive gunners would be tracking the approaching fighters already. At 500 yards, the tracer would begin. It began at 600. Harlow pushed the throttle through the gate to emergency war power, and the Corsair surged forward with the particular violence of 2,000 horses finding no resistance. And then the formation was around him. Ju-88s at close range, large as houses, their glazed noses and gun positions going past on both sides. And his thumb was on the gun button, and the 6.50 calibers in the wings were firing. The recoil of 1,200 rounds per minute working back through the airframe as a vibration that he had learned years ago over Guadalcanal to interpret as the aircraft doing what it was made to do. The lead Ju-88's left engine produced a sudden, dense black smoke, and the aircraft's nose dropped, and it began to fall out of formation. He was through and past before he could see where it went. Behind him, Duval came through the formation on a different angle, not straight through, but oblique, the way a man enters a room without announcing himself, taking the time to choose a target and hold the approach long enough for the deflection shot to be clean. The Ju-88 he fired at rolled away from the formation, trailing fire from its right wing root. Duval's voice on the radio telephone said a single French word, and then, after a pause, two more words in French that Harlow could not fully translate, but whose meaning was evident without translation. Novak, running the second element's approach, had two Focke-Wulf 190s come down on him from above, the escort reacting to the attack on the bombers, diving through their own formation to reach the Corsairs, which was aggressive and competent and exactly what a good escort fighter pilot did. Novak's response was immediate and without any quality of surprise or panic. He pulled the stick back and to the left, and the Corsair went vertical, with the R-2800 at full power, climbing at a rate that the Focke-Wulfs could not match, and at the top of the zoom climb, he pushed over and came back down with the altitude advantage now his and one of the two Focke-Wulfs below him and slightly ahead. The shot was brief. It did not need to be long. On the radio, Harlow said, "Good work, Novak." Novak said, "I am learning from the machine." The fight lasted 11 minutes by Bird's watch, which he checked afterward with a slightly dazed expression of a man surprised to find time has continued its normal operation while other things were occurring. The German formation did not reach Southampton. The bombers that had not been shot down or damaged turned back over the channel, and the escort turned with them, and the sky above the Hampshire coast was empty except for the Spitfires and the Corsairs reforming and the slowly dispersing contrails of what had just happened. Harlow counted his aircraft, 4 Corsairs, all present. He looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the engine instruments. Then he looked at the coast of England below him. Green, solid, ordinary, not burning, and turned for home. The hit came from the left and below, the way the worst ones always did. Out of the blind quarter, out of the place you were not watching because everything in front of you required watching. Harlow had just broken off from a second pass on the German formation, pulling hard right to clear the defensive crossfire between the Ju-88s, when the Focke-Wulf 190 came up through the scattered cloud layer at 7,000 feet and put a single burst into the left wing root of his Corsair before Bird's warning reached him on the radio telephone. The cannon shells, 20mm Mauser MG-150s, the standard armament of the Focke-Wulf 190's wing cannon stations, walked along the underside of the wing from the fold point to the engine cowling, and 3 of them found something important. Harlow knew it before the instruments told him. The aircraft moved differently. Not dramatically, not immediately uncontrollable, but with the slightly wrong quality that an experienced pilot reads, the way a doctor reads a pulse. A quality that said something has changed in the structure of this machine, and what has changed matters. The oil pressure gauge was the first instrument to confirm it. The needle dropped from its normal position, in the green arc, comfortable, unambiguous, and kept dropping. The cylinder head temperature began to rise. A thin smoke, more gray than black, began to trail from beneath the left side of the engine cowling and wrap back along the fuselage in the slipstream. Bird saw it at the same moment. "Harlow! Harlow, you're smoking! Left engine!" His voice on the radio telephone had lost the cheerful quality it normally carried and replaced it with something more fundamental. "Break off! Break left! I'll cover your 6!" "I see it," Harlow said. His voice in his own headset sounded calm to him, which he had learned over 116 combat sorties meant nothing about the interior situation, only about the discipline of the man managing it. He checked the position of the other Corsairs. Korn was working a retreating Ju-88 to the northeast, closing for a final pass. Duval was reforming from his second attack, climbing back to altitude with the Corsair's supercharger doing its work. Novak, Harlow found him last because Novak was where he least expected him. 300 feet above and 200 yards to the right, sitting in a position of altitude advantage that gave him a view of the entire developing situation, and clearly had not arrived there by accident. "Novak," Harlow said, "you have lead. Bring them home." A brief silence. Then Novak's voice, without inflection, without question. "Understood." Harlow turned for England. The English Channel below him was gray and cold and textured by the October wind, and it was approximately 22 miles from his current position to the Hampshire coast at Dover. The oil pressure needle was still dropping. The smoke from the cowling was thickening. Not yet fire, not yet the specific orange-black that meant fire, but the dense gray-white of hot oil meeting hot metal in quantities that were increasing and not decreasing. The cylinder head temperature was in the red arc. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 was an engine of formidable robustness. It had brought men home from worse than this, from Pacific atolls where the nearest friendly airfield was 100 miles of open ocean away. But it was also a machine, and machines had physical limits, and the physical limits of this particular engine were now the most important fact in Harlow's world. Bird pulled up alongside him on the right, close enough that Harlow could see his face through the plexiglass of the canopy. Young, tight, the smile entirely gone. "Harlow," on the radio telephone. "Oil pressure? Dropping. Temperature? Red." A pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained a considerable amount of thinking. "Jack." The use of his first name, which Bird almost never used in the air. "You're not going to make the coast. The engine's going to seize. You need to jump." Harlow looked at the coast of England. White cliffs, barely visible through the haze at the horizon. Real and solid, and exactly as far away as it had looked when he made the mental calculation that had produced the decision to stay with the aircraft rather than transmit a distress call and put a parachute between himself and the channel. He had made that calculation in approximately 4 seconds, which was about as long as the situation had allowed. He thought about Danny Cole. He thought about it with the specific, precise quality of a man who has thought about the same thing many times and has learned to think about it quickly and completely and then set it aside. Danny Cole had bailed out over Boone, with the aircraft at a speed and altitude and angle that had made the horizontal stabilizer an unavoidable geometry problem. Danny Cole had not known about the geometry problem because nobody had told him. Harlow had watched it happen from 200 yards behind and had spent 14 months afterward explaining to every pilot he trained exactly what the geometry problem was and exactly what it required in terms of exit procedure to avoid it. He knew the exit procedure. He had briefed it to Korn and Duval and Novak 2 weeks ago in the crew room at Dunstable, in the specific technical language of a man who had seen the alternative. But he was looking at the coast of England. "I'm going to make it," he said. "Harlow, calculate your fuel, Bird. Don't argue with me. Get altitude and keep watching my 6. Bird went quiet. Harlow could feel him there on the right, just outside the arc of his peripheral vision, keeping station with the dutiful tenacity of a 24-year-old from Georgia who had been told not to argue and had decided not to argue and was arguing with every cell in his body by staying exactly where he was. The engine deteriorated. The smoke was black now at the edges, and the vibration through the airframe had developed the slight irregular quality, a tremor rather than a pulse, that meant at least one cylinder was no longer contributing evenly to the rotation of the crankshaft. Harlow reduced power as much as the aircraft's ability to sustain altitude permitted, trading every available knot of airspeed for distance toward the white line of the coast, which was becoming more specific now. Cliffs, the line where chalk met sea, England in the most fundamental form it could take from the air, a nation's edge. He crossed the coast at 4,000 feet with the engine producing a sound that Sergeant Murphy would later describe, with his characteristic economy of language, as not right. He turned northwest. Dunstable was 11 minutes from the coast at cruise speed. He did not have cruise speed. He did the mathematics again, which produced the same answer it had produced the first time, which was that the mathematics were not comfortable, but they were not impossible. The radio telephone. Bird's voice, level now, the fear managed into something useful. Dunstable has you on radar. They're clearing the pattern. Emergency services are standing by. Good. Jack? A pause. The engine is going to quit before you land. I know. Then, I know, Tom. I'm going to fly it as far as it goes, and then I'm going to land what's left. Another silence, different from the previous one. Dunstable appeared below the nose at 3,000 feet. The rectangle of the airfield, the grass of the main strip, the hard standing where 4 Corsairs had stood in a row 2 weeks ago with their wings folded, and a group of British and French pilots had looked at them with various gradations of skepticism and alarm. The emergency vehicles were positioned along the strip's edge, their lights visible even in the afternoon overcast, red and amber strobing against the gray. The engine quit at 800 feet on final approach. Not gradually, not with warning. It stopped, the way a mechanical thing stops when the last physical tolerance has been exceeded. And the Corsair became, in that instant, a glider of 12,000 pounds with the aerodynamic qualities of a large piece of military hardware that had not been designed for unpowered flight. The propeller windmilled. The nose wanted to drop. Harlow held it, coaxing the last of the aircraft's forward energy into distance rather than descent, buying every foot of runway he could buy with the altitude he was spending. The Corsair hit the grass hard. The left main gear, weakened by the cannon damage to the wing root, buckled on contact, and the aircraft yawed violently left, departing the prepared surface and plowing into the grass border with the left wingtip carving a long scar in the English earth. The emergency vehicles were moving before it stopped. Harlow sat in the cockpit for a moment after the aircraft came to rest. He did not move immediately. He looked at the instrument panel. Everything in the red or dead. The needles at their stops, the engine gauges telling the story of what had just been asked of 2,000 horsepower, and what 2,000 horsepower had delivered. He looked at the left wing. The fold point. 3 bolts, Vought engineering, rated to 8 times the force of gravity, was intact. The wing was crumpled at the leading edge from the ground contact, but the fold mechanism itself had held. The wing had not folded. It had not folded in the air under battle damage, and it had not folded on the ground under the impact of a hard off-strip landing. And in the specific grammar of what Harlow had spent 2 weeks trying to teach, this fact meant something. Bird reached him first, coming over the wing with the speed of a young man who has been watching the last 10 minutes from altitude and has a great deal of stored energy to discharge. He grabbed Harlow's shoulders through the cockpit opening before Harlow had fully stood. "You absolute idiot," Bird said with considerable feeling. "I told you to jump." "You would not have been able to cover me from the tail section," Harlow said. "At that speed and altitude, the exit geometry was wrong." Bird stared at him. Then he laughed. The specific laugh of someone who has been very frightened and finds the transition to relief almost physically painful, and held on. Korn arrived at the wing root and stopped. He looked at Harlow for a long moment with the expression of a man who has recently flown his first combat sortie and has various things to say about the experience and is organizing them in order of importance. "Thank you," Korn said finally, "for the 2 weeks." "You flew it," Harlow said. "I only explained." Korn looked at the damaged Corsair, at the crumpled wing, the oil-black streaks along the cowling, the buckled gear, at the fold mechanism, intact, doing its job. His expression moved through something that was not quite the distrust of a fortnight ago, and not quite admiration, but occupied the ground between them where honest professional respect lives. "Satanic construction," he said quietly. And in the way he said it, there was everything that the 2 weeks had produced, all of it. The arguments and the hard landings and the channel and the fight and this moment on the grass of Dunstable with an English October darkening around them, compressed into 2 words that meant something very different from what the same 2 words would have meant when he first said them. Duval took Harlow's hand and held it without speaking, which was its own kind of speech. Novak stood at the edge of the hard standing looking at the folded, no, the unfolded, the intact, the holding, wings of the damaged Corsair. He stood there for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, "You said, trust the machine." "Yes," Harlow said. "I understand now," Novak said. "It is not about the machine." Harlow looked at him. "It is about not allowing fear to break what holds." The evening came down over Bedfordshire in the English way, quietly, without drama, the light going gray and then gone. Murphy appeared from the direction of the hangar with a rag in his hands and looked at the aircraft with the expression of a man assessing a patient. "We'll fix it, Captain," Murphy said. "Good bird. She held." He folded the rag, put it in his pocket, walked back to the hangar. Harlow reached into his breast pocket and took out a photograph. A young man, smiling, standing in front of a Corsair somewhere on a Pacific island, the sun behind him and the whole world apparently ahead of him. Danny Cole, 20 years old, from Chillicothe, Ohio. Harlow looked at it for a moment, then he put it away. Above Dunstable, through a break in the overcast, the first stars of the evening had appeared. English stars, cold and clear and indifferent to the particular affairs of men below them. But there, above a country that had not burned today, above 4 aircraft that had gone out and come back, above men from 4 different nations who had learned to trust a machine with folding wings, and in doing so had learned something that was not, in the end, about the machine at all. Epilogue. The title card read as follows. The F4U Corsair entered service with the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm in 1943. British pilots developed the curving landing approach that solved the visibility problem, a technique the Americans subsequently adopted and called the British method. Flight Lieutenant Edward Corn flew 47 more combat sorties in the Corsair. He survived the war. Pilot Officer Pierre Duval returned to Lyon in May of 1945. His family was alive. Flight Officer Hana Novak flew with the RAF until the final days of the European War. He returned to Czechoslovakia in the summer of 1945. Captain Jack Harlow returned to the United States in 1944. He taught at the Naval Air Station Pensacola until the end of the war. He named his son Daniel.